The best way to capture a shallow depth of field is to shoot with a fast prime wide open, but there are several reasons why you may not be able to do that. You may have been shooting a landscape and you were shooting for a large depth of field, but then decided that you would have preferred to have a shallower depth of field, or like in this shot here, you were shooting with flash. You didn't have an ND filter that fit your lens, so you had to shoot at, say, f8 or f11. But one of the great things about Photoshop's neural filters, which are AI-powered filters, is that one of them, depth blur, allows you to achieve a shallow depth of field effect. Now, it doesn't work 100% for every image all of the time, but in many cases, it does a pretty good job, and it's really, really easy to use. So let's take a look at how it works. So to activate the filter, just go to Filter and then Neural Filters. Sometimes when you try to access neural filters, the option is grayed out in the menu. For some bizarre reason, it's just a glitch. If that does happen, just hit Control and J or Command and J if you're on a Mac to duplicate the background layer, and that seems to kick it into action. But it's rare that it happens, but it does sometimes happen, and it can be confusing. So here we have the depth blur filter, so I'm just going to switch that on, and that will bring up the controls for us. So I've just made the image slightly smaller so that we can see the whole shot as we're working. So at the moment we have the default settings, so the focus distance is the actual position within the scene where the focus is set. So with it set to 0, you can see that the image is nice and sharp here on the left, and then it gradually drops out of focus as we move over to the right. Because there is a slight angle in this scene, Photoshop can identify that. So with the focus distance, we can just change that point of focus, so I can move it to the back, and you'll see there that the background is now nice and sharp, whereas the foreground is completely blurred. So for this shot here, I've already found that the perfect spot for the focal distance is 30. So there we see the model is nice and sharp. We've got a tiny amount of fall off on the left, and then we've got much more fall off on the right. So the focal range, this is essentially the depth of field. So at 0, it's the shallowest depth of field possible with the filter. And then as we move it over to the right, so if you watch the right hand side of the image, you'll see that it begins to sharpen up once the processing has occurred. So that's just become sharper. And if I take it all the way up to 100, we just get back to the original image where it's as sharp as it was pretty much. Now there is also a very simple to use checkbox here, which is the focus subject. So if Photoshop can identify the subject in the image, and it's always worth trying, especially if you're working with a portrait, you can just hit the focus subject option there, and it generally does a pretty good job of finding the subject. So I'm just going to stick to my manual settings with the focal distance at 30, focal range at 0, and then we can move down and have a look at some of the other sliders. So blur strength is exactly what it says on the tin, so you just drag it over to the right to increase the amount of blur, or take it over to the left to reduce the amount of blur. So by default it's set to 50, and you'll see there that 100 really doesn't look quite right. So what I'm going to do here is just take it down to 60 so that it's a tiny bit more blurry than the default setting. And we also have another slider here called haze. So when you're shooting wide open, you typically get a kind of haziness in the bokeh. And if I just take that up to 100, you will see that we get a really nasty kind of grey effect, predominantly on the right hand side of the image, but we get a little bit on the left as well. So you don't want to go too heavy with this. For this shot here, I'm just going to take it up to 10. And then down below, you can play with white balance, saturation, brightness, and grain. Obviously, you can use these, but there are other better tools within the main Photoshop interface for controlling these settings. So I would typically control those externally from this filter. So the final thing to cover is the output, and we have several options here. So I'm just going to expand this menu, which has popped outside of the screen, but the options are we can apply the effect to the current layer, to a new layer, to a new layer that's been masked, to a smart filter, or to a new document. So I'm going to keep it set to new layer, then just hit OK, and then that generates a new layer where we have that blur. And if I just toggle between the two, you can see the difference between the before and after. And it's not as good as shooting with a true prime lens wide open to get a lovely shallow depth of field, but it's not bad at all.